60 knots.
Check.
V1, rotate.
Are the mics on?
The mics are on. Welcome to episode 10 of the Blue Skies podcast. On behalf of Northern Lights Aero Foundation, we are your hosts, Trisha and Aryan. Today we're incredibly excited to be joined by Dr. Suzanne Kearns, pilot, professor, author, and a global leader in aviation education. You're a founding director of the Waterloo Institute of Sustainable Aeronautics, WISA, and a key contributor to ICAO's Next Generation of Aviation Professionals, NGAP initiative. Dr. Kearns, you have an extremely dedicated career and background, and we're excited to delve into your insights and your journey and just learn a little more about you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Kearns, let's start with your early journey. If you could just tell a little bit about yourself and what you do now.
Sure. So I grew up in a small town called Wyerton, Ontario. A lot of pilots probably know Wyerton. We have a big runway and not a lot of other things going on in a pretty small town. But I grew up right under the circuit path of the local airport. So growing up, there were always small general aviation planes flying over my childhood home. So from a young age, I started pointing at the airplanes and telling my parents, like, hey, I want to do that one day. I want to be a pilot. And now, as the mom of teenagers, I think it's amazing that my parents said, okay, and they signed me up for flight lessons when I was 15. So I started flight training when I was 15. I soloed on my 16th birthday, and then I finished all my training up to my private license for my fixed wing rating. But my birthday's in September, so I was just kind of waiting for my birthday. So they signed me up to learn how to fly helicopters. So I lived over the hangar of Buttonville Airport over the summer and flew helicopters. So I had my airplane and helicopter training before I had my driver's license. And so when I turned 17, I had my private fixed and rotary wing licenses signed off. It was funny at the time because they did like a news report. And I was so excited. I'm like, oh, I'm going to be on the news. And the newscasters, they did a little segment. And then at the end, the commentator and the woman was like, wow, imagine that, flying helicopters and still wearing braces. And then my ego went, oh. So aviation was just always a part of who I was. I ended up going to Canada College in North Bay. I did their 1-year commercial helicopter pilot program. But then at the end, trying to get that first job, no one had told me previously that getting an entry-level helicopter pilot job as a woman in Canada can be really difficult. At that time, most of the jobs are in bush camps and they don't have facilities for men and women. So I sent my resume to literally every helicopter company in Canada and did not get a job. So I started looking at what I could do to keep building, keep moving forward. So I went to Embry-Riddle in the States. So they have a really amazing aviation university. It's literally connected to the Daytona Beach Airport. So you can go to math class and walk to your planes and go flying. And everyone there is a pilot. so it goes from being defining aspect of your personality to being the same as every other person on campus. And so I finished my fixed wing training and my degree there. Then at the end of that, a few different things happened at the same time. And I was wondering if maybe being a pilot wasn't what I was meant to do. So I went back to school, did my master's in human factors, and then came back to Canada. And what I realized is when I was out of the country, I started the first university-based aviation degree program at the University of Western Ontario while I was in the States. So they hired me as a professor there when I was 24, and I've been a professor for the last 20 years. So I was at Western for 12 years, and I've been here at Waterloo for 9.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm.
So that program didn't exist initially, which is why you chose to go to Embry in the first place. Oh, I see. And then when you came back, how did you get the opportunity to start working there? Did they reach out to you?
No, I sent a cold I heard while I was finishing my master's that they'd started a degree program. So when I came back to Canada, I was trying to get a job, but there wasn't you have to understand the difference between Canada and the US when it comes to aviation education is that Canada, it's historically been at the college level, so more of an applied skill set directly to a job. But because it wasn't previously in universities, it meant that I had a master's degree in Canada that was unusual. It wasn't like there was a job market to move into. So it was kind of struggling. So I was sort of living in my parents' basement for 3 months, questioning my life, playing video games. And anyway, so I sent a cold resume to Western just out of the blue. And they, because they were the first degree-based program, they were looking for somebody who had at least a master's to come in and teach. So it just all sort of happened. And then I did my PhD while I was working there full time.
I might have missed this, but what drew you to come back to Canada and not pursue your career in the States?
I'm proud to be Canadian, and I have a very strong connection to my family and my home. So it's just felt natural to me.
Do you think that your career in academia would have come if you didn't have this hurdle of the job market at the time that you did?
No, I can tell you my 16 or 17-year-old self did not dream of being a professor. Like that would seem like a horrifying suggestion when I was young. And so I think that it's one of those things that it's really challenging that we ask young people to make decisions that are going to impact the next, 20, 30, 40 years of your life, because who you are when you're 17, 18, 19, it's really hard to predict what your values, what your priorities, and what your lifestyle needs are going to be when you're older as a professional. So all I sort of recommend to young people is, now that I have teenagers myself, is find out what you're passionate about. Like when you're learning, like when I was reading textbooks and I was learning to fly, I would always go to the human factors chapter first. That was the most interesting part for me. I just tell people, just pay attention to that and then put everything you can into succeeding where you are today. But just be aware of what lights that spark up inside of you. And for me, having that awareness, like I knew I liked that human factors space, that opened the door for me to go into my master's and to pursue more academic pursuits. But now I feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing.
Was there a defining moment where you realized you wanted to work towards helping the industry in certain ways rather than just being a part of the industry? So be it a professor or a pilot.
I don't know that it was ever as grandiose as wanting to help the industry. Now I think with WISA, that's where I'm at. Like I want to try to mobilize as many things as I can to support our sector, bringing together all the different professors and research. But when I began, for me, it was more about just students. Like once I had the opportunity to start teaching and realizing that it's a tremendous privilege to teach people who have the same passion that you do. And you've gone through those hard lessons already. Like you struggled, you faced those challenges, you faced those barriers. You know what that means. And to have an opportunity to try to help them and to be of service, even in a small way, that for me was really eye-opening. Like I felt like teaching is a big part of me recognizing more what I'm meant to do and how I can be in service of the sector. And it's interesting because I don't think I was very good at it at the beginning. Like, because I teach 3-hour lectures, which is not always, nobody was like, hey, sign me up for the 3-hour lecture. But it was a few years where I remember the very first time I taught a 3-hour lecture and I had everybody's eyes up the whole time. Like I had their attention for the full 3 hours. And I remember driving home and calling my husband and being like, you won't believe it. Like this was amazing. But it's hard. Like it's hard earned and it takes a lot of time. But I guess it's like anything in life, right? Like anything that's worth doing and any skill set that's worth building is worth taking the time to invest in. But teaching's just like flying, just like anything else. You build that skill set up over time.
Did you ever have any experience teaching before you moved into that position? That was your first time?
Yeah, no, it's interesting when you're a professor because when you want to be, my husband's a high school teacher. When you want to be a high school teacher, you have to go to teacher's college for a year, now 2 years. When you're a professor, you just have an advanced degree and they hire you and you start teaching like 2 weeks later. So no, I was pretty nervous when I started, like the very first lecture. I was sweating, and like I said, I think it took me some time to build that up. But it's like I said, it's a real privilege because the people who are in my classroom, they want to be there. And now I've won the highest teaching awards here at the University of Waterloo, and I've had some wonderful recognitions for teaching, but I don't look at it that way. I feel like teaching is the other way. Teaching is about, I think, being in service to the students and supporting them.
I think, yeah, that's a good mindset to go into it.
So you mentioned that your husband's teaching high school. Do any of your kids see themselves going through aviation as a... No?
No, I've exposed them to, all sorts of different aviation activities, as I'm sure you can imagine. Yeah. But, my parents weren't in aviation. They're entrepreneurs and they have their own passions. And so when I expressed a desire to move into aviation, they were 100% supportive behind me. So I feel like that's kind of my role as a mom is sort of, I'll expose you to this wonderful world of aviation, but ultimately I want them to find what is their passion and to pursue that. And I think that they see aviation as like a nerdy mom thing because like they're like, mom likes airplanes, like ha ha ha. Yeah. So my house is a bit different from other houses in that sense, I think.
Yeah. Now this is a bit more of a personal question, we'll come back to your career, but what was motherhood like being a professor, being so busy and focused in your career and adding this personal aspect into it?
Well, I think it's a really important question to ask, especially from a group that advocates for supporting women in aviation, because I think the pandemic changed things. Like the pandemic made it and normalized people working from home and being in the midst of with all their children. But before the pandemic, there was more of a culture where you kind of hide that aspect or it's unprofessional. And that's just not how my world works. Like my children are by far the most important priority to me over work, over anything else. Mm-hmm. I have 3 kids and I had them while being a young professor and had many, many experiences that were challenging because of that. I've taken babies to meetings before and like all sorts of different things. And academia, like aviation, has a history of not being balanced. It's much better now, but historically not balanced between men and women. So all sorts of different challenges. But academia also gives you more flexibility. Like if I was a pilot, I wouldn't be home as much. And, my whole days when the kids were young were, get up, get them taken care of and situated. And then I would work until, they're back home for the day, from school. And I'd be with them till they go to bed at 7, and then from 7 till like 10 or 11 you're working again. It's not easy. It's like having 2 jobs, but I feel like that's where so much of the value of life for me comes from.
So you chose to go into the academia sector. Did you ever look back and think, would things have been different if you decided to still pursue flying and becoming a pilot and taking that route instead? Or were you generally happy with that decision?
No, I'm happy with my decision. I feel like I said before, I feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. I feel like I can have impact in this space and I can support other people in finding their passion and their journey flying. Like I get a tremendous amount out of teaching and having that experience. Like I find that really rewarding. So I think it's important for people who are coming into the industry just to recognize that, like I said before, that where you start may not be where you end up, and that's okay. As long as you pay attention to how you're feeling and what's fueling you and what's, contributing to enriching your working experience, that the beginning as a pilot can lead to all sorts of different opportunities that you may not expect.
Which is an important point because you mentioned earlier that it's a lot to ask for the young people to figure out what they want to do at a young age. I also think that with some students, when you are so driven for an end goal, you lose sight of that piece that you could be taken against another path. And at least for me sometimes, or some of my peers, I'll notice that if we do go down a different path, we don't see it as opening other doors. It's just another door that's taking us further away from what we envisioned ourselves doing. So I think that is important for the youth to remember that aviation isn't just being a pilot. It could be many other things.
Yeah, well, then that was really the origin behind my textbook. So I wrote a textbook that gets now used in translations all over the world. But the purpose behind it was this question of that I kept teaching students and seeing them over and over again, the sort of the same thing repeating, where students would be passionate about aviation, but they would run out of money to continue flight training. Some had like severe motion sickness, or they just questioned, I don't know that this lifestyle is going to fit with me for the rest of my life. And then I would see them leave aviation. And then at the same time, when you go to international organizations, they're saying over and over again, there's this massive shortage of aviation professionals, not just pilots, but every professional group. And it's this tremendous loss. Why are these young people leaving aviation if they love it? Why aren't they moving into another aspect of the aviation industry? And I thought so much of that is because of the way we teach people in aviation, that we teach you to be a pilot in Canada. But what does it mean to be a controller? What does it mean to work at an airport? Or what does it mean to be a manager? So the textbook is about flipping the traditional educational approach upside down. Sort of what if we started aviation training with this broad foundation of how aviation works, giving you a taste of all the different careers and how they fit together. And so the purpose behind that is to help young people that if they can't pursue their first passion, they are aware of all these other opportunities, and they can take that love for aviation and apply it to different skills and different jobs.
What's the name of that textbook?
It's called Fundamentals of International Aviation. Now, in the second edition, I just got the contract for the third edition, which I have to find time to write.
Congratulations.
Well, congratulations. I got a big job to do.
Could you tell us a little more about ICAO's next generation of aviation professionals?
Yeah, so ICAO's NGAP group is basically a volunteer committee that looks at how we can attract, educate, and retain people within aviation careers. So I was heavily involved with this before the pandemic, and I haven't been as involved, but there's been a resurgence of the NGAP group. I know they're having a conference in August of 2025 in South Africa, I believe. So I think it's a really critical, a really important issue, but it was a lot of discussions in that group that helped me shape my approach, and particularly the approach behind my textbook.
And how did you get involved with them?
So when I was early in my career as a professor, the way a professor job, I'm not sure most young people know what it means to be a professor. So professors' jobs are typically 40% teaching, 40% research, and 20% service. And service is anything you do to kind of give back to the world. It's serving on committees and doing that kind of work. So when you are beginning your role as a professor, so what they call an assistant professor, then you have 5 years to prove yourself. And at the end of the 5 years, you go up for tenure, is what it's called. And when you go up for tenure, you have to put together all of your writing, all of your research into a package, and the university sends it out for review. And the external reviewers assess it, and they either grant you tenure, which means you basically have a job for life and you move up a rank to an associate professor, or you don't get tenure and you're dismissed or you lose your job. So it's really high stakes. So when you're in that pre-tenure phase, you want to build your network. Like you want to situate your research with something that's going to have an impact on the world. And you want to, for your service tax, you want to be involved in committees and different activities where you have broader impact so that when they send your dossier out, people say, hey, you're doing important work. So when I was pre-tenure, I started to get involved with a group called the University Aviation Association in the States, or the UAA. The UAA represents about 125 colleges and universities and with aviation programs. And then I was elected president of that group. So I served a term as president. And it's through the network of that group that I was connected to ICAO's NGAP group.
And you're still volunteering with them to this day, 15 years later?
NGAP, yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How did you become president of that? How did you join that organization in the first place?
So the UAA, you can just Google it, and I think any university or college that has an aviation program can join. And then once you join, you start serving on different committees on a volunteer basis. And then once you build up your impact, you could put yourself forward to be elected as president. It's a volunteer role.
And you described earlier your split is 40%, and 20%. Is that something you've kind of decided personally, or it is the general sense of what people do?
That's the typical professor workload for all professors. Now my workload's a little bit different because I run a research institute. So now I have even more service and research and less teaching, which makes me a little bit sad because that's my favorite part. but that's, I guess, the cost of trying to do something that you think is going to have a big impact.
Yeah. Well, one of the key areas you influenced that you also mentioned was how aviation professionals are trained. So let's talk a little more about your competency-based training and educational innovation side. So NGAP's major goals being CBT, like you had mentioned earlier. Let's actually talk about what CBT even is, and then we'll transition into more questions.
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer. I also want to ask you guys what you think it is.
Yeah, so I think we briefly spoke about competency-based training versus time-based training with Marlene Schillingford. Yeah. And from our sense, it's like you can go on a flight and instead of your first lesson being, okay, we're doing straight and level, second lesson, we're doing climbs and descents. Mm-hmm. It's you go based off the person's skill and what they're able to understand and capture. So if on a lesson, they're able to go straight and level, climbs and descents, turns, then you take all that and then you move on to the next. There's no reason to repeat just to pass a 20 hours, but it's just based on a student's progression and what they need.
Yeah, that's a good definition. Yeah. So it's fundamentally what you said is it's customized to the individual's needs and it is based on competencies rather than time. So time is always going to be important in training. We can't just say it's not something we're going to reference because time is where the cost of training and the footprint of training is. But fundamentally, what it means is that competency-based training does not use time as the metric for moving forward or progressing in training. But it's far more complicated than people think. So let me back it up. So if you think back to like the origins of aviation training, right? Like you imagine you're an aviation pioneer and you have to make the very first training and licensing criteria for being a pilot. What are you going to do? You're going to think, okay, well, what skills does a pilot need to do this job, right? Like what are the hands and feet skills? We call them psychomotor skills. What are the testing, thinking skills? We call them cognitive skills. And what kind of like attitude and communication and awareness, workload management, we call them soft skills or effective skills. So what skills do you need? And then you can imagine when you would design a training program, right? You're like, okay, I think they probably need to do this many hours in a plane and they need to do this kind of a written test, right? So you can kind of imagine where that started. But then what we've seen over time is this kind of evolution of what it means to be an effective pilot, what we call competence, to do a job versus training and licensing criteria. And I would sort of flip it back to you and you say, do you think that there's a possibility that people would ask a question of what do I need to pass the test versus what skills do I need to do the job?
Probably the first part.
Yeah, I've taught classes before, and I'm not naive to the idea that students are like, yeah, but what do I need to pass the test? And then the big question is that, well, what is the test? The test is trying to demonstrate that you can function as a competent professional, right? So when we think about competency-based training, it's trying to refocus training and licensing criteria away from teaching to the test or training to the test, training to a set number of hours, and more focusing it on what does a person need, what knowledge, what hands and feet skills, and what we call effective skills, non-technical skills. What do they need to do the job? And let's make that the criteria. So that's the goal. People usually simplify it down to say it's focused on competence instead of hours, which is true. But then if you go one layer deeper and you're like, what's competence? Like, write it down. It's really hard. It's really complicated because if you think about anything you're an expert at, right? Then maybe you guys do you have hobbies?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like if you're a musician or if you're an athlete, if I give you a pen and a piece of paper and I said, write down every knowledge, skill, and attitude that you need to be an expert in that field.
It's a long list.
Yeah. And you're probably going to miss stuff because there's stuff that you do without thinking about it, right? That's why competency-based training is really hard because that's really what we're asking. So the way that we sort of structure what is competency-based training, you have to think about it as being a three-tiered approach. So the first is professional competency, like I said. So if you're an expert in something, basically competency means the ability to function in a professional role autonomously. Nobody's looking over your shoulder. No one's correcting you. You can 100% meet the criteria for that job by yourself. That's competence. But then one layer up from that is written competency. So statements. So that's like I said before, like if you guys try to write down every knowledge, skill, and attitude you need to be an expert in something, that's a hard thing to do. So there's a gap there, like actual professional competence versus written statements trying to describe it. There's going to be error. There's going to be simplification. There's going to be challenges. And then once you have these written competencies, the next layer up is competency-based education. So it's taking an entire education and training system. And instead of referencing, I got 80% on a test and I did 50 hours, it's when you're demonstrating performance aligned with these written competencies, then you can progress. So it's a training system that's referencing these competencies. But it's language, it's words, right? And everyone knows words can be interpreted. Numbers are a lot easier from that perspective than written descriptions. So there's another layer of error there because it's people interpreting these written competencies, making sense of them. So it's a very challenging concept. So I wrote a book on competency-based education with some co-authors in Australia. And that was a really interesting process. So that like three-tiered approach, all of us, because it's so complicated, we all like wrote it out on sticky notes and we keep it on our computers. And as we're writing the book, keep going back to referencing that orientation because there's a tendency for people to oversimplify what the concept is. And while there's a lot of potential advantages for it, there's a lot of challenges too. And frankly, our training system, it works really well. Now, like we have a very safe and effective training system. So we don't want to risk or sacrifice that while we're integrating competency. So it's all about, there's frankly a lot of questions left to answer about how do we integrate this in a way that adds value.
Could I ask how the educational system works in terms of how are courses chosen for programs? And does that have anything to do with how competency-based training works, in the sense that you asked, what are the skills that pilots need? How do we know what courses then that Waterloo or Seneca or these institutes offer?
Yeah, it's universities take a lot of direction from the professors, because the professors are intending to be the experts in the field and to know a lot about not just where we are, but what's coming, and sort of reshaping the curriculum. But there are oversight bodies. So ABI, the Aviation Accreditation Board International, so they originally were part of the University Aviation Association and branched off to become their own entity in the States. And their whole mission is just to answer that question. It's like, what skill sets do we need to make sure are in academic programs, so that whether you're getting a degree in one university or another, that we know that there's the same kind of foundation. But it's challenging because that's an American-based entity. Canadians, universities and colleges have their own approach for approving and accrediting programs. So like with the University of Waterloo, I'm really proud of our program. I'm really proud of what we do here. We're not ABI accredited, not because we don't value their contributions and value that structure, but just because being an American system, it doesn't perfectly fit with the way we do things. It's complicated.
Yeah. I can only imagine that this research is very useful, although very difficult for pilots, because it is almost directly related to how we train and what we do. And if anything, it is a perfect fit for this industry. But I guess that just, like you said, it's very complicated. And
well, there's a lot of the research we do. So it's CBTA, so it's competency-based training and assessment. So the assessment piece is a really hard part of that, because like if you think about if you've done any flight training, the role of an instructor, a lot of it, other than observing hands and feet and things people say, like you fundamentally can't see inside a person's head, right? Like you don't know if they performed well accidentally or if they are like way ahead of the game and they're aware of, having a thought process and a level of expertise that's way ahead. So not being able to see inside a person's head and just sort of assessing based on what's visible, that's a lot of the focus of the research we're doing now. So I'm part of a cluster of human factors researchers. None of them previously were in aviation. So they bring sort of neuroscience and vision science, artificial intelligence, all these different areas together. And so we're using biometrics, which is like, for example, eye trackers, as an indication of the way your eyes move around a flight deck. When you analyze that data, it can give you an indication of whether they're functioning like an expert or functioning like a novice. So trying to make the invisible that happens inside your head more visible. And that's a really cool project. Yeah. It's one of my favorite things I've had the opportunity to be a part of. And the other professors, like that's really fun too. Like if you bring professors from different disciplines, we call it, in the university world, we call it interdisciplinarity, because in like the world has problems, but universities sometimes have departments or disciplines. They don't mesh. Like universities are inherently narrow and very deep. So how do we take all that expertise and bring it together and apply it to real problems? And so this cluster that we're a part of is a really good example of that. It's a lot of fun.
So what impact do you see CBT having on the next generation of at least pilot professionals?
I think that it's important, like I sort of described previously, that if we want to continue progressing these skills and evolving training practices, that we need to think about evolving how we teach, aligned with what we know, right? Like, how do we know we can train people in the best way possible? But also, there's elements of justifying advanced technologies when we can show evidence that they provide value to learners. So what I mean is like, I think you'll probably know in your ab initio flight training, a very limited number of simulator hours, and new technology, things like virtual reality or these sort of hybrid simulators, also limited in how much they can be used in training, even though simulators are no emissions, so they're better from an environmental perspective, usually less expensive for students, and usually more profitable for flight schools. So it's kind of a win-win-win, but you need the evidence to show that they're effective. So some of the experiments we're doing, that's one of the goals, is to try to justify the safe integration of more use of flight simulator time.
And this is part of your research towards CBT.
Mm-hmm.
And why do you see a need to kind of evolve our training system? Like you said, the way it is now, it works and it's safe. So why is the need to kind of push into this?
I think that, like, on a fundamental level, most pilots would recognize that having a training system referencing hours, there are inherent limitations in that, right? Anybody who's sat in a classroom knows that not every hour of classroom time is going to result in the same amount of skill development, right? Like some hours could change your life, and some hours I teach lectures with 250 people. They're not all super engaged. Like they might be thinking about other things. Just because your body is physically in the room, it doesn't mean it's having an impact. So it just doesn't make as much sense with today's understanding of how learning works and training technologies to rely exclusively on time as a reference. So I'm not saying get rid of it entirely, but I'm saying that if there's a possibility where we can support young people, we can demonstrate competency in a way that is safe and efficient by maybe using more sim time or letting them practice on a VR, like something affordable. And by doing so, that we're able to achieve the goals of having more people enter the workforce at a lower cost while not sacrificing the economic viability of our businesses. Like, for me, that's a win-win all around.
That's true. It seems like time-based is an old way that we used, but we've improved on it so much nowadays. But instead of just sticking to the old system that we've worked on, it's good to start building up into the next generation almost of technology.
Yeah. And we want to do it with the industry. So this isn't sort of the academic world coming in to change things. Like we have a lot of industry partners who work really well with the Waterloo Wellington Flight Centre, as well as Transport Canada. Also through WISA, we've brought in some fully electric planes. And that's another example of like the only way we can collect data is we hire student pilots to fly them. They extract the data, they send it to the university, and the faculty analyze it and send learnings back to the flight school and Transport Canada. So this kind of a cycle. This is the way we answer questions. It's together, leveraging, supporting, listening to each other, and figuring out how we can all address what comes next.
Well, you mentioned the opportunities that exist with e-learning. VR simulators itself. What are some of the challenges that you've seen through this research?
Yeah, so my PhD is actually in education, but specifically instructional design for online learning. So a lot of my research, like I wrote a book on e-learning and aviation, is looking at how we use computer-based training to support our learners. And I think the biggest takeaway, and I often will say this at conferences, like raise your hand if the most powerful learning experience you've ever had was with e-learning. And everyone's like, no, because there's something really powerful and influential about an instructor, a mentor, a guide, somebody who can listen to you and answer your questions. So I'm the first to advocate for that. But I think that technology-based learning can play a really critical role in sort of like a sandwich model. Like if you could do preparatory training, because the challenge with the classroom is you have to teach to the middle. You have to teach to the average learner, which means some people are bored out of their mind. They're like way ahead. They're like, this is too basic for me. And some people are lost, right? Like they didn't do any pre-reading. They don't know what you're talking about. And that's just how classrooms work, right? The teacher has to teach to the average learner. But you can use e-learning and different tools to give foundational knowledge with like a mini quiz so that by the time they get to the classroom, they have that foundation, like they're ready to take in new information. And then we know, I don't know if you've heard of the forgetting curve, but if you want to feel horrified, like you can Google it afterwards, but you forget a shocking amount of material very quickly after you leave a room. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but something like 50% in a day or two. And if you think about how much money our industry invests in recurrent training, and all the regulations are based on recurrent training, like imagine going to an operator and saying, that investment, do you know half of it you've lost in a day? That's crazy. But like, I think we all know, if whether you're using like a language app or, different things through mobile technology, like you can ping that learning to try to maintain it at a higher level so you're not forgetting. So I think that technology-based learning or e-learning plays a really good role sort of before and after, or for people who, like if you're on the other side of the world, if you don't have access to come to a classroom. But there's significant limitations with it as well.
Yeah.
So from my understanding now, it seems e-learning is used best as a supplement to the original learning and to help boost.
Yeah, I think so because, AI is changing a lot right now, though. Like AI is creating a situation where you can have e-learning, where you can talk to it like an instructor and it can answer you immediately. So that's, kind of changing that game. So we'll see how that continues to evolve. But I think historically, I would say that yeah, it's powerful to have somebody who can be both a human mentor as well as a teacher in the classroom. And I don't love the idea of eliminating that. There's ways you can replicate it. So we call them learning agents. Like you can create avatars and different characters to try to humanize and to make online learning more engaging and interesting and effective. But I still think having a human teacher is pretty powerful.
Yeah.
Was that part of your research as well? Like
the physiological, I guess, of effects of having an in-person human teacher?
We've done some of that. I haven't done it personally, but there have been other studies that I've read and referenced that talk about the improvements in learning when you have a learning agent as part of the curriculum and the people engage with it more. And I think it just fundamentally comes back to how have we always been taught, right? From childhood, we're taught with a teacher. So the equivalent would be like kind of death by PowerPoint. It's like you get like 200 PowerPoints that are white slides with text on them. And it's like,
we have some.
Everybody has. Yeah. Or you can use a more modern e-learning where it has characters teaching you and you can build mini case studies and examples and you can give them like more hands-on practice. And that like, the ability to answer questions, even if you get the question wrong, there's a lot of research that shows that it improves learning outcomes. So there's a lot of things that you can do to make it as good as possible, but I still see it as secondary to the people who are the teachers.
This is a wild thought, but do you think that this ever has anything to do with the boredom or the innovation behind things? So we talk about PowerPoints, death by PowerPoints. And sometimes that always brings me to the thought that maybe 20 years ago when PowerPoints weren't a thing, the switch from a chalkboard, whiteboard teaching aspect to having a PowerPoint was good enough. Nobody cared if it was black text on a white slide. And now we've seen that for a while and now we crave something further. We want avatars and colors and we have the ability to manipulate that. Do you ever think that in 20 years, case studies and having these things will also become a norm and we need to now entice our brains with something else?
I think human brains are kind of the same. I think that we just know more about how to teach better and have a higher expectation. I think younger generations as well, because you guys have more exposure to technology. I think you may have a lower threshold for accepting really boring presentations. Like the e-learning that I build, like I'm really proud of it. Like we use avatars to sort of like pretend to be different people in a company and try to present like the idea, like if you were a young person in an operator and you're just talking to people in the company, like what would their perspectives be? What challenges would they face? And how would you approach that? And what responses would you give? So that it gives like the ability to, as a shortcut to move through experiences that otherwise might take longer if you're moving through it in the real world. Yeah. So there's some good elements of it for sure. But I don't know. I think death by PowerPoint still exists. I always, when I go to conferences, I'm always really interested, because as a teacher, like I teach a lot of big classes. And so in conferences, I'm always looking at the audience, because as soon as you can see it, as soon as the audience, all the eyes go down, it's like they're not hearing anything that's being said anymore. And so how many classrooms and how many conference presentations have no impact at all because everybody is distracted or on their own devices? I think a lot. And then you go back to that time-based training, right? How impactful was that hour? Yeah.
Well, sustainability is another major focus that you've worked on, and your leadership with WISA highlights that. Can you tell us a little more about WISA and what you do with the Institute there?
Right before the pandemic, and as you see, I'm wearing an aviation hoodie, but a lot of my students, they're always branded aviation, like they're very obviously aviation people. So at the end of my AV 100, my first year class, a big class, like 200 students, I had a group come down at the end of the lecture to the front, and they're kind of hanging their heads and like feeling bad. And they say, "Can we talk to you?" And I was like, "Sure, what's going on?" They said, "Other students on campus are giving us a hard time." That they came up to us in the cafeteria and they said, "You should be embarrassed to love aviation. You should be embarrassed because aviation is part of the problem. It's contributing to climate change." And they're like, "What does this mean? Like, can you love aviation and the planet at the same time?" And that struck me like a ton of bricks, because nobody had ever asked me that before. Like, climate change, the environmental impact of aviation. I went to one of the leading aeronautical universities internationally. It was not part of the curriculum. So it was just not something that was as something that people were talking about. And then the pandemic hit, and I had the experience of engaging with several students who had just graduated. And of course, they're carrying really heavy debt loads from paying for their flight training and suffering financially, figuring like, what are they going to do when the industry is at a standstill? And I felt a lot of guilt because my job is secure and I can be a professor from my basement during the pandemic. And so started thinking about what we could do as a university, try to be in service to the sector so that when a recovery happened, maybe the industry would be a little bit better off than before. I taught a class on aviation sustainability for a few years, so I knew what sustainability was. I wouldn't say it was my area of expertise, but I started asking, like, what do I see as the biggest challenges facing the future viability of aviation? And I thought of those as being three things. Because of my work with ICAO's NGAP group, I think personnel shortage, not enough people in the system. Second, that was right when like Greta Thunberg led a climate protest outside of ICAO headquarters during the assembly that year, and the flight shaming movement was gaining momentum. So the environmental impact, I thought, was the second. And the third threat, I thought, was a rapid evolution of new technologies. So everything from like 5G and phones to AI to cybersecurity challenges, that if our industry can't navigate and move through those challenges, it's a threat to our businesses. So those really align with the three pillars of sustainability. So social sustainability, creating the workforce of the future. So it's flight physiology, human factors, it's equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's mental health to help people have like valuable careers. Environmental sustainability, all about reducing and eliminating environmental emissions, sustainable aviation fuels, it's avoiding contrails, it's ground-based operations, maybe using electric tugs and everything at the airport itself. And then economic sustainability. In our world, we really think of it in terms of the new technologies. Like, how do we validate and understand these new technologies so they don't pose a threat to our sector? So that's cybersecurity and artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing, kind of everything in between. So that's really what WISA is. So during the pandemic, I went from being, the only aviation professor in a program where it's just me teaching students and kind of I'd have my industry applications and conferences, to I started reaching out to professors across campus one at a time, and having like amazing conversations over and over. And it would always be the same thing. It would be, tell me about your research. What are you passionate about? And I'll tell you how that connects to aviation sustainability in some way or another. And just having that conversation over and over and over again. And what's amazing is how many professors, like, they're as passionate about their field as I am about aviation. And they're thrilled about the idea that it could apply to aviation in some surprising way. So put forward a proposal to the university and had maybe 30 or 40 professors supporting it to launch WISA, which launched in 2021 in the fall. So now we're about 3.5 years old. And now we have 155 professors who are members of the Institute. We launched a new grad program called the Collaborative Aeronautics Program that lets master's or doctoral students add a focus on aeronautics to their studies. They get their degree title -aeronautics, so like Master of Psychology -aeronautics or PhD of Systems Design Engineering -aeronautics. That's really cool. A lot of fun. So it's like bringing new talent and new ideas and new expertise, because the big problems facing the future of aviation are not aviation problems. They're sustainability problems, climate problems, or human problems. They're technology problems. And so while aviation has this like rich depth of aviation expertise, I feel like the most impactful thing we can do for our future is create a bridge to bring all of that other talent into our sector to help support us and navigate what comes next.
You mentioned that WISA focuses not only in sustainability in one way, but in those three different ways. What made you want to expand it to such a general in three different sectors? Did you ever want to focus in just one area first, or did you always see WISA covering all areas of sustainability?
Yeah, I always saw it covering all areas, because I think the challenge is, if you think of it in terms of climate change, obviously one of the biggest existential threats facing the future of human beings. But if you think about aviation professionals, if you go to current aviation professionals, and like I said previous, like they were trained in a way where climate change, environmental impacts were not part of the curriculum when they were going through school. They love aviation like the rest of us, right? It's a part of their personality. It's who they are. But if you go to them only talking about climate change, sometimes there's a little bit of resistance. It's sort of like, well, the fastest way to eliminate emissions from aviation is to eliminate aviation. And that has drastic societal and economic impacts on the world. Like we just went through COVID when there was no aviation. We all know what it's like to not have mobility or have that possibility of mobility. And so sustainability inherently is broader. Like sustainability is about optimizing the good and working to reduce or eliminate the harm. Right? So we want to take advantage of every societal, cultural benefit of aviation, every economic benefit. We want to support the businesses in the sector. And then we want to work towards reducing and eliminating the negative environmental impacts, not shying away that they exist, but recognizing there's good and there's bad as part of this. And I think it's only in having that balanced approach that we have the ability to move forward. Because if you think of it only in terms of the climate change impacts, some of the solutions proposed are really, really difficult to implement, like sustainable aviation fuel, which all projections are showing are the biggest chunk of how we're going to achieve net zero by 2050. But sustainable aviation fuels are very, very expensive. And for operators, that's already the biggest expense for operators, like 30% of an airline's cost. Now it's, significantly more than traditional jet fuel. But even if it was only a small percent more, it's going to be flowed over to passengers. And then you look at it from a societal perspective and say, well, if aviation only caters to the richest in society, and right now, I believe that about 50% of emissions come from the top, 1% wealthiest of society. So do we as a society want to accept that aviation is just something for the wealthy and that most people can't afford it? Like there's a huge challenge there of what it means. So I don't think we can answer these questions thinking only about it in terms of one dimension. I think we have to think about even SAF, like where is the feedstock coming from? Is it being made from food stocks that are needed for livestock to feed people? So there's just so many dimensions to the issue. So have you ever heard of the Sustainable Development Goals or the SDGs? Yeah, that they're inherently very interdimensional. And I think people would argue that aviation connects to all, but maybe life below water, maybe not that one, but all of the other ones. And I think it's so essential for people to recognize that sustainability is about, like the most common definition is meeting our needs today without sacrificing future generations' ability to meet their needs. Mm-hmm. So it's inherently focused on the next generation. It's future-focused decision-making.
From where you guys started with WISA to where you are now, how have your goals shifted throughout time?
Originally, when WISA started, so as a founder of the Institute, I was just really excited that anybody was interested in this. So it was sort of like any professor I talked to, I'm like, please, yes. It's like, join us. This is amazing. And we're still like that. We're very broadly inclusive. Any faculty member, any researcher who has an interest in sort of joining WISA, we're thrilled to have them on board. But as we've been looking to the future, we've been really thinking more strategically about like what are the big research challenges where we as an institute can really mobilize a movement of people. So we're starting to define what we have now 5 areas are. We're hoping to launch those in September. And we think that that's going to be really powerful. And the example is one of those would be the human factors group that already exists, but to sort of build those out, to have one on energy, to have one on AI and modeling, and sort of have others in key areas, because we can't do everything, but we have unique strength here that if we can move the needle on a few specific targeted areas, I think that's where we can have the most impact.
This kind of reminds me of what we said earlier in the conversation, where in aviation, there's a place for everyone. And right now, you're actually bringing people outside of aviation into aviation to help collaborate on this large goal. It's quite beautiful.
But it's what I think is really beautiful about it is that students have my heart. Like I would say aviation students are my people. Mm-hmm. And that's the only sad part about WISA is I don't get as much time. I used to teach them like every year across the 4 years of the program. I only teach now them in the first year of the program, but they are mixed into the research community. So I've been spending a lot of my time trying to mobilize and catalyze this research community, but it only works because we also have about 400 pilots on campus. So if researchers are flying the E-plane, they need to hire students to actually fly it and collect the data. Or if we're doing research in our flight simulators with eye trackers, we need student pilots to come in, like we need human people to act as research participants to support that. And so that's what's really cool, is that I hope it kind of enriches their experience and so they can get a sort of, often research takes quite a long time to move from the lab to the world. But if you're a participant and you get to use some of these technologies, you kind of get a glimpse of what that means and where we're headed. So I hope that answers a question a lot of students would have, is why would I get a degree to be a pilot when you don't need a degree necessarily? You could just get your ratings. But I think there's two answers to that. One is I think we can enrich that education in some really cool and fun ways. The second, and I think it's important for all young people to think about, is if you lose your medical, well, what comes next?
Yeah, that's really cool that you get to involve students. You're right that it definitely enriches their experience, and it gives them kind of a hope of what the future of aviation will look like. And not only that, but I feel like in any sector, when you become involved with the community and you start helping out, it boosts your own motivation to kind of keep pushing forward. And in aviation, there's always times where there's a bit of a lull, where your motivation might go down, like the winter. The winter is a big one. And when you're involved in stuff like this, it's definitely very beneficial to the students.
But I want them to know, too, that if they're like me, if they've realized for whatever reason for themselves, they make the decision that being a professional pilot isn't viable for what comes next, that there are so many options. And it's not just the operational roles. Like what I'm trying to create at Waterloo is to really create pathways in a Canadian university for graduate level roles, right? So if you want to get a master's or a doctoral degree, they're not for everyone. Like I think many people who want to fly would think, no, thank you. But for many, it's really exciting and inspiring, and you find new talents and new passions and new communities where you can be the aviation person, like bringing that expertise to the group where it's valued and listened to and appreciated. And you're working with neuroscientists and working with cognitive psychologists. Like it's pretty cool.
Yeah. I did want to ask if you had any mentors or role models. You mentioned that your family wasn't involved in aviation, but anyone else that was noteworthy along the way?
My parents were my role models. They're sort of self-made. Like they didn't go to university. I didn't have anyone who was an academic prior to me in my family, but they showed me what it means to put all of yourself into something. So, just like I think people would say about me, like my job is it's a part of who I am. Like you can't pull it apart from my personality. And I think if you want to develop expertise in anything, I think that role modeling is really important, right? Find something you're passionate about. Find something that is exciting. It feels like it's aligned with your skills, where you can have an impact and feel like you do a little bit of good in the world, and then lean into it and like fully embrace it. But they also, they really put family first. And I think that's critical too, is that a job can't be everything. Like a job has to complement what else fuels you in your life. And I'm not great at hobbies, but I'm pretty good at being a mom, I think.
Yeah.
My students said, would you be offended if I got you a mug that says Aviation Mama on it? I'm like, no, I love that.
Yeah. Well, to summarize the work that you do, what do you think the aviation industry needs urgently at this point? You're involved in so many ways in this industry, but what could you summarize?
I think we need to recognize that sustainability isn't a threat to our future. Sustainability is the pathway to our future. That like I said, it's about future-focused decision-making today. And just as an illustration, if we had a magic wand and we could wave it and create like a perfectly net zero aircraft, like a perfectly electric net zero aircraft, but if it was exponentially more expensive than traditional aircraft, so no companies or no students could be able to afford it, and we didn't have enough people in the system, we don't have instructors, students, maintenance engineers, controllers, that society can't realize the benefits if it's only a technology solution and if it's only focused on the environmental impacts. And it's sort of this multi-dimensional approach that we need to foster. So I feel really strongly that developing sustainability fluency is really critical. Like I think it's something that should be integrated into a part of all of our educational systems, not just for new hires, but for everybody in the system, and start thinking of sustainability in a similar way that we think of a safety culture, with the idea that sustainability can't be achieved if it's just one person behind a closed door who's a sustainability manager, that sustainability needs to be a part of everyone's job every day. And we need to stop thinking of like moonshot, like some amazing technological solution that's going to solve this problem for us, and start thinking like, what's one small thing I can do today, even if it's just making a small difference. And maybe it's an environmental thing, like creating a recycling program. Maybe it's a social sustainability thing, like talking about anti-discrimination programs, or maybe just bringing sustainability into the conversation. But I feel like your generation needs to be mindful that you shouldn't feel paralyzed by this problem, because if we think of it and we leverage our aviation safety culture skill sets to start thinking about integrating it as a foundational principle into how we work, I think we have a good shot of achieving some of these big goals.
And for young people, especially women who are considering entering the aviation field as a career, what advice would you give to them?
I would also say to follow your passions. I get a lot of really wonderful young women who are leaders and who are brilliant in the classroom. One thing I have heard with some people who have graduated and entered industry is that it's not necessarily the case that they're never going to face specific challenges of being a woman in a field where there aren't not a lot of women. And so I would just encourage them to lean on their support network, to lean on other women. And I think the reason why those graduates come back and talk to me is because I can relate and I can understand and provide some support. So just, I think what you're doing is absolutely critical, that you're never alone. And there are people who have walked this path already and they found a good outcome on the other side of it. But the road from, being a student to reaching a career that you're happy with, that you feel fulfilled by, is not like a straight line to success. Like I would characterize my path as more of a series of failures. Like, you don't think you're going to end up here. You just kind of, you stumble and you pick yourself back up again. You do it over and over and over again. And that skill set of resilience is hard. Like it's heartbreaking at times. It's really, really challenging. But I think the more we can realize that we're not alone and that others have succeeded and have got to the other side of it and they can talk about it, I think it's important too, that's critical.
With such a driven lifestyle, do you ever find yourself feeling tired? How do you get through demanding work days? You mentioned you don't have any hobbies, but how does that work?
Yeah, the problem I have is that like writing books for me is like fun. Like it's like a hobby. So I think I have the challenge where a lot of the things that I feel are sort of my personal interests are mixed up with my professional interests, sadly. I think everybody gets tired. Everybody has good days and bad days. And there are going to be, times in your career where you're like, this is like a dream. Like everything is amazing. Like everything's going really well. And then something can strike you out of like a dark corner that you weren't expecting and then really pull the rug out from underneath you. And that's where I said before, you have to just really lean on your support structure and system. So for me, it's my family. For me, it's leaning into the things that recharge me and give back to me. But I think it's really important that people are just aware of that. And from a stress-based perspective, like if you look at the stress research, stress is cumulative, right? So, we have in my human factors class, like a list of all these life events. Many of them are positive, like having a baby or buying a new house or having a wedding. But even positive things, anything that causes a disruption to the status quo, it sort of accumulates as stress in your body. And over the course of a year can lead to some significant challenges. So I just hope people are kind to themselves and give them space and support and pay attention to your own cues. Like what are my triggers where I know I'm reaching a point that is becoming a problem? And then I also tell my students to like write down a list. Like what are like 3 or 4 or 5 things that refuel you, right? That's something that is going to help recharge you for what comes next. And it's different for everybody, but I think that it's helpful to think of it and really strategically use it when you need to.
I think we could probably do a whole other episode with you.
Yeah, it's just so interesting and it's only just touching the surface, but I think it's important because now anybody who else is a student out there, like you said, it's our generation. I think I'm sure that they're just as inspired and interested in this conversation as we are today.
Yeah, I think you gave them a good hope for the future. And also just, aviation is open for everybody and giving everybody a chance to come and join. But Thank you so much for meeting with us today and doing this episode.
And thank you for the work that you do in this industry and the doors that you open as well. It's really inspiring.
Well, I think you guys are doing great work.
Thank you very much. Yeah. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us again for our episode with Dr. Suzanne Kearns. We've been your hosts, Trisha and Aryan. We're wishing you blue skies and tailwinds ahead. We'll catch you next time.